Welcome, everybody. Welcome to another episode of PEM Rules, the Pediatric Emergency Medicine podcast. I'm your host, Jaron, as usual. And today, I'd like to dedicate the episode to answering an email I received a few months ago from a listener. As you've heard before, I encourage everybody to contact me through the website with interesting stories, questions, or requests for future episodes. So a few months ago, I was contacted by a Pediatric Emergency Medicine Fellow named Jaron Smith, who's a first-year Pediatric Emergency Medicine Fellow in Texas. He actually works with a previous resident of mine who is now also a PEM Fellow there. And Jaron had a very interesting email and a very interesting story that he wanted to share with me. And I'd like to share that story and that clinical vignette with you guys. I'll tell you briefly that Jaron did his pediatric residency at Phoenix Children's Hospital. He is a husband and a father of not one, not two, but 3 kids. And at the time of this recording, soon to be 4, Jaron has interest in ultrasound and global health. And he spent 2 years actually in Siberia, Russia, on a church mission during his undergraduate degree and a couple of months during med school in St. Petersburg. Let me just say, Jaron, I'm quite impressed with this resume at your young age. Being a father, being a doctor, going on the missions, again, very impressive. And thank you for all the work that you do. And thank you for contacting me with this great story. So Jaron indicated in his email that he's a big fan of PEM Rules. Thank you, Jaron. And he said that there are many, many rules that have stuck with him. But the one that he most recently implemented was the most important of them all. Rule number 1, it's not the patient's job to prove that they're sick. It's your job to prove that they're not. I got to tell you, Jaron, as a Pediatric Emergency Medicine Fellow, in first year especially, I struggled with this, and it took me quite a while to understand what that rule really means. Jaron specifically indicated in his email that because most of the children coming his way are really well-appearing, he finds it inappropriate to apply this rule to everybody. Jaron, I completely understand how you feel, but I advise you to always apply that rule to each and every patient. And if the patient looks well, normal vital signs, normal exam, chief complaint is not particularly concerning, you don't have to do anything, maybe just reassure the mom, but you always have to prove somehow that the patient is not sick. This can be easily done with a good history, with a good physical exam, maybe some labs, maybe some imaging. However, as a pediatric emergency physician, I highly recommend you always keep that rule in your mind, as you certainly did. I also recommend that while thinking about it, you keep in mind rule number 56 from episode 15, worried parents don't go home. So if I think the child is fine, but mom and dad do not perhaps agree with me, and some workup is indicated to put them at ease, I think that is totally fine. Again, keeping the commitment to the child and not necessarily doing too many invasive tests, or certainly not tests that involve radiation like CT. I try not to do that for the sake of reassurance, but certainly reassuring parents is something that we all have to be aware of and do to the best we can. So Jaron had a shift in the pediatric emergency department a couple of nights prior to emailing me a few months ago when he saw a teenage girl who came with multiple vague complaints that included headache, dizziness, heart palpitations, and abdominal pain. She had a recent history of COVID-19 infection, as well as history of anxiety and depression, that she had been on fluoxetine for a few months, but stopped it recently on her own accord. Easy, Jaron thought. It's either post-COVID symptoms, or possibly her untreated psychiatric diagnosis, or a combination of both, but that rule came to mind. It's not the patient's job to prove that they're sick. It's your job to prove that they're not. And Jaron thought to himself, I can definitively say this isn't a heart problem, so I need to get an EKG. He thought of a few other diagnoses that can potentially unify her symptoms and obtain some labs. At the end of the day, it was all negative, but he was able to prove that she was well and she was not sick. Jaron indicated in his email that he was very happy he did it. He didn't feel like he went overboard with his workup, and he literally said in his email, I wish you could give some amazing outcome, something interesting or unusual where I caught something significant, but I actually found no interesting findings on the evaluation, labs, etc. And he actually apologized in his email for doing so. Jaron, I gotta tell you, what you described is my typical day in the pediatric emergency department. And I applaud you for doing what you did. You certainly proved that she was not sick. Psychiatric issues or post-COVID-19 cannot be definitively diagnosed in the pediatric emergency department, and you can't prove that the patient's symptoms are secondary to psychiatric problem. Nor do they need to be. It's your job to prove that the patient is not sick. So in this case, you prove that this is not arrhythmia, this is not a surgical abdomen, etc., and you did a great job doing it. Great job. The second thing that Jaron discussed in his email was it doesn't matter how many patients are in the waiting room, everybody should still get the same level of care. He always hears residents, fellows, and even attendings mention how busy the ER is and there are 70 plus kids waiting. This is very stressful, let's move on, let's move quickly, etc. And while he agrees with those situations, he also has to keep in mind that it's really not fair for the patients in front of him to rush their care. That doesn't mean he doesn't try to move fast and be as efficient as possible, but he doesn't let the waiting room dictate his decisions. Jaron, again, I completely agree with you. This is actually rule number 95, which I don't believe you heard of before you contacted me because I didn't record that episode. I call it see the patient, not the waiting room. In other words, the patient in front of you has a certain need, and whatever that patient needs, we as providers should provide. If the ER is busy, if the waiting room is full, whatever other patients you have doesn't really change any of this. So if the patient in front of you needs a full evaluation because they're ill-appearing or they have some red flags in their history or physical exam, by all means you should go ahead and give the patient what they need. The fact that there are 50 patients in the waiting room is unfortunate and certainly stressful, but it doesn't change what the patient needs. I agree with you. See the patient, not the waiting room. The next thing Jaron mentioned in his email was one of the rules that he likes. When you have nothing to lose, you can only win, from episode 12. However, Jaron applies this rule a bit differently, and I like it. Jaron indicated in his email that as he is learning slowly, there are many personalities in the pediatric emergency department, and many times he disagrees with his co-fellows or his nurses or pharmacists, but as one of his attendings mentioned to him, is slowly learning how to play nice in the sandbox. If the difference between two treatment modalities is preference-based and not evidence-based, then it's probably best to just play nice in the sandbox. If the respiratory therapist recommends a trial of albuterol on a child with bronchiolitis after you suction him with no response, it's probably okay. If the nurse suggests giving bicarb during a code when we're already 3 doses of epinephrine into the code and it seems like it's not going to help, it's probably fine. Jaron, I couldn't agree more. When you have nothing to lose, you can only win. And sometimes that rule applies to medicines or treatments, but sometimes that rule applies to just playing nice in the sandbox. And if the respiratory therapist recommends a treatment that you don't necessarily agree with, however, if it's not going to harm your patient, sure, why not? Play nice in the sandbox, be a team leader, be a team player, and make other people happy while taking care of patients. I completely agree. Sometimes that rule applies to clinical medicine. Sometimes it applies to playing nice in the sandbox and making another colleague happy. The last thing that Jaron discussed in his email is my own rule, rule number 64, which I discussed in episode 19, but he put it in a different way. Jaron was saying how he has been taught, and I agree with it, you can always pick up more shifts, more work, do another clinical project or research project, but you can never get time with your family back. It is so easy for us physicians, pediatric emergency physicians, or any other physician in our line of work to work hard and see more patients and dedicate more time for our careers. Add another QI project to our list, or research project, or teach another lecture, or prepare another lecture, etc. Really, the list doesn't end. However, we can never get time away from our family back, and I think we all know the famous saying, nobody says, I wish I spent more time in the office on their deathbed. I talk about it as rule number 64, which I recorded in episode 19. I call it, the most important things in life are usually not found in the workplace. We all have families, we all have friends, we all have our well-being and social life. It's very important that we take care of ourselves and have something outside of the ER. Career is certainly very important. Medical career is very demanding, but I think it's very important to keep in mind there are other things in life. and the most important things in life are probably not found in the pediatric emergency department. Certainly, as a father, as a husband, other commitments should come first. Thank you, Jaron, for all those comments in your email. I really appreciate it. I think you did a great job with your patient, and I think you brought up some very interesting points to discuss. As a thank you, I'd like to answer your request and dedicate an outro to you. So Jared mentioned in his email that he really liked the intro to the song by the Jackson 5, I Want You Back. Great intro. Not exactly the music I listened to, but I certainly agree that the Jackson 5 had some great music and did have a great bass player. And that is it for today, guys. Thank you very much for listening. I appreciate it. Please do the same like Jaron. Check out the website and submit any questions or any stories you have. I love hearing from you guys, and I'll be more than happy to discuss your response or your email in future episode. Have a great day, and there is the Jackson 5, I Want You Back.